we're gonna go ahead and get started because I've got a firm commitment at 3. Diane is my sole board member at the moment. Oh, sorry. Joy. I'm apparently overlooking this.
We're garbage.
Would somebody like to call us to order?
You do it, board member.
I call us to order. It's 1:32 p.m.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started with also doing introductions. I apologize, I'm having a rough day. I'm Jeff Aaron. I'm the manager of the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
Hi everyone, I'm Joy Andrade and I am on the board, HPI board.
Dylan Schell, Regional Director of Community and Housing Services with New Vista.
Marty Jones, Community Action Council.
Alicia Duras, Volunteers of America Mid-States.
T.C. Johnson, McKinney-Bento, Fayette County Public Schools.
Allison Compton, Greenhouse 17.
Diane Fleet, Greenhouse 17, and a board member.
Bo Reflet, HPI board.
Christina Ellison, New Beginnings Bluegrass.
And also our friends in the back.
Savage and Army, Hero Double. Devin Owen, Natalie Sisters.
David Overson.
Tony Cody, Bluegrass Navigators.
I apologize about us being kind of geographically spread out. We're going to go ahead first with the approval of the April 5th minutes, which were included in the packet. Would there be any corrections or discussion? If not, can I get a motion to approve?
I will make that motion.
Second.
All right. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion passes. Moving into new business, we have several items that I'm going to do the best to my ability to present to you. Originally anticipated that Marissa would be presenting these items, so please give me a little bit of grace if I am not able to do them as eloquently as she would have prepared them. First, we're going to start with a coordinated entry report. We had formally done reports of the coordinated entry system within the HPI board meetings, and we're looking to try to resume that activity. We are going to be trying to do that at least quarterly so that we're continuing to take a look at the effectiveness of our coordinated entry system and identify gaps, issues, challenges. We have both a more straightforward report in a table form, as well as a more dynamic, visually appealing report that Marissa had put some efforts into. Speaking first on the table, we're going to be looking at the periods of January, February, and March. So that first table is going to give you the overview information about the service of the coordinated entry system. So we served roughly around 1,000 persons each month. Those are not going to be unique to each of those months, but will be the total number of persons that remained on the list at that time. We also have some figures about the number of individuals that were added to or exited from the by name list. You're going to definitely notice that we had a much higher amount of persons that were exited during the quarter, and that's primarily trying to do cleanup of the list. So this would be working with our providers to figure out who's already transitioned into permanent housing and is no longer in need of assistance, and also things like persons that are no longer within our system or have not had contact with any providers. Our policy is that we have to try to have contact at least once every 90 days for someone to remain active on the list. We're generally pretty flexible with that requirement and try not to exit someone without doing due diligence to make sure that there's not a partner who's had communication and is able to facilitate contact. Also going to get some figures around average and median length of participation that's separated by leavers and stayers. Our ultimate goal for coordinated entry system is that we would be able to house someone within 30 days of presentation. As you can see, we're nowhere in the ballpark. So more work to be done. In terms of the number of referrals made, this is going to shed some light on why the length of time on the list is quite as lengthy as it is, and that's because we have far fewer resources than we actually presently have persons in need within our community. So we were able to make just under, looks like about 22 referrals were made for that quarter. That includes referrals to both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. You can also see some information regarding the acuity scores of the individuals that were referred. In terms of referrals, most of those referrals were successful. The referrals that were not successful, I would have to follow up with Marissa to get further information on what specifically happened with those. I'm going to guess that that was due to individuals that were no longer in contact and that we did not have a way to reach out to. Another one of the challenges that we have is, of course, I'm sure as you direct service providers know, phone numbers change faster than we receive information about phone numbers changing. So that could be another hurdle. In terms of average length between enrollment on CE and referral, that's obviously going to be a much longer measure than between referral and project entry. So we're seeing that we have actually been able to refer individuals to permanent supportive housing more quickly than we have rapid rehousing, which actually is somewhat counterintuitive given the documentation burdens for PSH. I think that has to indicate that we likely have been improving our ability to have that documentation pre-completed so that when those referrals are made, that we're spending less time trying to collect that information. Additionally, Marissa's also included the length of time if we want to look at the period from enrollment all the way through when somebody is enrolled into a project. And then in terms of successful housing move-ins, we had 3 move-ins for the quarter. 2 were for rapid rehousing, 1 was for permanent supportive housing. And in terms of enrollment to move in, this would be the measure of once a referral is made and the individual accepts the resource, how long is it taking for providers to actually get somebody physically housed and move into housing? And so we're seeing that we, again, are having a shorter length of time for permanent supportive housing, which I would not have necessarily anticipated given some of the more challenging barriers to housing that some of our PSH participants would have. And rapid rehousing, we had lengthier periods of time. Looking at the fact that we have those longer times in rapid rehousing, I'm going to clarify with Marissa, but I'm going to guess that some of that may have to do with the fact that with rapid rehousing, there's not necessarily the same level of support from the agency, in that a lot of our permanent supportive housing programs are either master leasing or can upfront commit to longer term rental assistance, where rapid rehousing, that amount of assistance is going to be determined on a quarterly basis, which may make it more difficult to identify landlords where there's not necessarily a long-term guarantee of rental support. In terms of capacity, our rapid rehousing resources are being utilized at least 80%. In March, we have that up to almost 90%. And then our capacity for permanent supportive housing, we are very, very close to having those resources all allocated. So we're doing a good job of making sure that we are replacing those vacancies as they become available. I'm going to also attempt the presentation that Marissa had prepared. So this is going to show us this information just in a little bit more engaging format. So we had 8 referrals that were made in January, 4 in February, and 10 in March. Each dot would represent a different referral that was made, and it's hard to see all of the information here, but if we were to hover over, this is going to give us the full details on each of those referrals. I'll try to see if we can get this to you in a different format where you might be able to view it on your own screen, but it would include things like the referring agency, the type of program, whether or not the referral was successful, and track a lot of those measures individually so that we have a little bit more robust information to help us understand what we can do to improve the success rate of referrals. Here, we're going to see the programs that individuals were referred to. Those are all color-coded. Again, we can make sure that this is available to you electronically. And similarly, if you were to hover over those, we'll be able to see all of those same measures that we were tracking with the initial referrals. So of the referrals that were made, 86% of referrals were for rapid rehousing and only 14% were for permanent supportive housing. We tend to have more rapid rehousing beds within our system, and those vacancies tend to open up more quickly. Again, our folks in permanent supportive housing are often staying with us long term, and we're still in the process of developing successful move-on strategies. It can be a challenge when someone gets to the point where they really only need the rental subsidy and they no longer require or desire to participate in supportive services. We're still working on trying to beef up the inventory of resources that we could roll somebody off that only desires that rental subsidy. Again, we can get a whole host of other information so that we're able to better understand each referral that's being made. This would give us a little bit of information about household compositions. The majority of individuals that were referred, almost 60%, were individuals. Additional 18% were households that would include multiple individuals, and 23% were families with children. Looking at acuity, this just gives you a sense of the ranges within our by name list that we are able to serve. Since a lot of these referrals were rapid rehousing, that's where you're going to see a lot of those referrals down here in the lower acuity ranges, and fewer individuals in the permanent supportive housing range. So again, our goal is to design a system that quickly is able to rehouse persons upon presentation, ideally within 30 days. The current average length of time from enrollment to referral for all resource types is going to be 201.5 days. So we again recognize this doesn't necessarily tell us something that we don't know from practice. I think we've each worked with trying to assist clients and households where there has been a lengthy wait for resources. So we definitely need to try to look at the upcoming NOFO, see if there's any opportunities for us to add additional resources and aggressively pursue resources outside the continuum of care program in order to better meet the need. And lastly, this would just be a breakdown by the referring organization. This would help us understand where individuals were being referred to. So we had several individuals that were coming from an initial referral from the Salvation Army and the Hope Center, obviously our largest 2 congregate shelters, and then also from Greenhouse, Community Action Council, and Arbor Youth Shelters. Additionally, we had a couple that were coming from sources like Street Outreach, Mountain Comprehensive Care Center, and Natalie's Sisters. The color coding would let you know the program that they actually were referred into.
Jeff, where is Fayette County Public Schools as far as resources? Because that's primarily what our Family Resource and Youth Service Centers do, is work with our community agencies and referring. So is that not calculated into?
It's not going to be factored in here since Fayette County Public Schools is not in our homeless management information system. And this is only going to speak to referrals for those that are literally homeless by HUD's definition, in emergency shelter, on the streets, a place not meant for human habitation, and going through our coordinated entry system. I think sometimes you guys are utilizing resources outside of that to house persons, and even if you do have individuals that are going through the system, I presently have no way to see that information.
So that may be an area that we might want to look at, because that's what I'm doing from the state aspect of it, is through the McKinney-Vento, is that, you know, we are working with those agencies because our families are living in sheds.
And so like it could very well be that, for example, one of these dots could be a family that you're working with, but we just don't presently have any information that ties that household to understand that they also have a relationship with your family resource centers. That could be something like trying to add a field to our HMIS assessments that would ask the household if they have that kind of a relationship. With this kind of data, we have to preload it and design it in order to see it on the back end. So we just need to work on that mechanism, but I agree that's an opportunity for us. I would like to maybe schedule an opportunity for us to better understand exactly what steps that your team are taking so that we can then look at what would be the best methods for trying to track that. I'm sure that would be helpful to both of us in trying to pursue additional opportunities. So again, this was originally to be presented by Marissa. I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer every question that you'd have, but I'm glad to make an attempt or to take a note from Marissa. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions on the very first, like the tables. One, just in general, the like 3 move-ins for the quarter, is that roughly average? Like, is that typical?
So there's a couple things that it's kind of hard to say. One being that from the time that this stopped being presented in the HPI board meetings previously, which probably would have been around 2020, until now, we haven't had this form of report in order to actually have the data to go back and compare what the average quarter is. And that's part of the intent here, is that we're able to start building that data so that we have a better ability to track progress, make longitudinal comparisons. My office only took over coordinated entry as of July 1 of 22, and both Marissa and I being new, I didn't even arrive until August, when I also still had another job. We have not had the capacity until now to start looking at this information at this scope. That is something that I think we should have the ability moving forward after we get a couple of quarters under our belt. And I think this is one of these areas where it's going to be very helpful to dig into, because when we're able to see if we have a quarter where we have significantly fewer or significantly more housing move-ins, what is facilitating that? Offhand, I would say it would be fairly typical that we would not have a lot of permanent supportive housing move-ins, given how rarely those opportunities come up, and that we have the ability to not only have a referral available, but also have a client who has all documentation and is document ready to quickly move in. And then the housing search process has gotten infinitely more complicated. So this is only going to track those who have moved in physically. So this is also going to account for the fact that there could have been additional clients that were close to move in, but maybe had not identified a unit and gotten through all steps yet.
Gotcha. Okay. And then my other question, maybe it may be too abstract to answer right now, but I'm just curious. You said at the start, you were talking about the goal length of stay is 30 days, and we're at 201.5, and you said that that's because we have too few resources currently compared to the need. I wonder, what do you think, like, how much would the system need to scale up in order to be able to actually do that?
I would definitely have to do additional analysis to arrive at any kind of a figure. It would also be multi-layered in the sense that we would have to calculate costs based on the type of resource that individuals needed. What I can say is that the length of our by name list, as you can tell from just the number of persons that were exited, has definitely dramatically improved over the last several months. We've identified a lot of clients who people have knowledge of moving into housing, and we found that, for example, some providers were not aware that if you are the housing provider, once that client is physically housed, you are the best source of information to confirm a successful housing move-in, and then it's your responsibility to exit that household from the coordinated entry list. We have providers that have been part of the system for years who say, had no idea that was my responsibility. So we're making sure that we're communicating these things as we identify it and trying to improve. Also, those that were inactive, we have a lot of folks who haven't been active within our system for a couple of years, and just because there hasn't been capacity somewhere for someone to be taking a detailed look at that list and take those steps to remove them, it's going to improve the speed. It's not going to necessarily resolve the situation where we don't have enough resources, but it is going to improve the speed, at least, at which people are moving in. I would also say that we very much need resources other than the Continuum of Care program. So multiple things. One is that there's obviously movement on home ARP funding. There are, I believe, I'm going to say 25 units across the different projects that the Office of Affordable Housing is funding with that money that are going to go towards serving those that are homeless. They're going to be tied to coordinated entry, and there are funds for the supportive services to be coupled with them. So that is a bonus. 25 units, still not going to solve the issue. Ultimately, we're going to need to identify some other funding sources that can be utilized, and I'm going to advocate that at some point, LMPCG is probably going to have to look at making a commitment to housing that is not just affordable housing, because we have to recognize that a lot of those units, in order to successfully make affordable housing programs work, it's a balance of, you can't have only individuals that are under 30% AMI. In order for developers to be able to successfully operate, they have to have mixed levels, and it usually results in a handful of units for our population. So I think we need to look at arriving at that information as to what the cost figures would be and what the number of units would be, so that we can advocate for an investment that's dedicated to this population, also includes the services, until we're going to actually see anything close to our goal.
Are these move-ins only including move-ins that are associated with a financial assistance from a program, or is it any kind of permanent housing?
So this is going to be those that will participate in our coordinated entry system specifically. So typically it's going to be things like our COC funded programs, ESG funded programs. The metrics for veterans programming would be separate, since we have a separate by name list and process. And it would not capture things like, for example, the Res Commission has their homeless intervention program that does 50% of startup cost. Those types of financial assistance programs do not participate in coordinated entry. Now, HIP does have HMIS data entry that they're doing. We would just have to work with them to develop a system that's able to track and be plugged into this. But there's a number of other financial assistance programs operating in the community, for example, through faith-based groups. that we don't presently have any mechanism to collect or analyze data for. So this is solely going to be rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing programs, or resources like emergency housing vouchers.
So some of the people who would be moved off the list might have found permanent housing, but we're not capturing.
We would be capturing them in the sense that we'll see them exit from this list, but we're not necessarily going to see them in our numbers for housing move-ins or referrals if that was not a resource within coordinated entry. We're only going to see the fact that they are exiting from the system and exiting successfully to some form of housing. So it's limited. Other questions?
Is there a way to run a report to identify people who are inactive? Because that could really help your list long term, is if you could easily flag people who have been inactive for 90 days or even, 6 months or something. So that really bogs down the length of time that people are on the list, and that's always going to draw your average. So I don't know if that's possible through HMIS, but.
Theoretically, there's going to be some challenges in what we would have to think through, because one thing is we have to have that mechanism to see the actual interactions that would show an update or ongoing contact. We've discussed, for example, that sometimes with street outreach, we don't always have an interim update to reflect each individual contact. And even so, if that update is on, say, the street outreach entry versus the coordinated entry project, we would have to be able to code a program that can read those updates across the system rather than across an individual project. And some of that's going to take some vendor support in order for us to be able to successfully code. But ultimately, that would be something that we would like to see happen. There would be some other mechanisms that we could utilize in the interim that would at least help us to see folks that we could very easily, for example, do reports that could pull the individuals that have the highest length of time and then do some manual checks, or look to see if there's some commonalities where it might help us arrive at some code to better develop a report to do it automated. But yeah, that's one of the things that we really need to continue to make progress on. That list should be a living list. It should be very current. It should reflect individuals that are currently in need and that ideally are ready to be almost immediately plugged into housing once it's identified. And I think that when we started this process, for example, the individuals list on coordinated entry had, I would say, at least 500 or more individuals, and we've now got that down under 300. So there's definitely progress in the data cleanup. It's just unfortunate that I feel like for the majority of the pandemic that across the system, not only our coordinated entry provider, but our housing providers, our frontline providers, everyone was just in a really bad spot. And one of the first things that kind of gets neglected is things like data and tracking. So I know this isn't the most uplifting presentation to start with, but there it is. If there's not additional questions, then hopefully the next topic will be a little bit happier. So also included in your packet were some PDF exports of 3 new data dashboards that are going to be replacing our existing data dashboard. As you know, Polly and I had worked on developing Lexington's first data dashboard, and while useful and giving us a place to start, it was not necessarily the most dynamic dashboard. It wasn't exactly what we had envisioned at the onset of that project. So something that we have done is working with Untold Content, the marketing team that's done our public awareness campaign. We identified some funding that had been set aside for social media advertising and decided to take some of that funding and utilize it to contract with Gaither Dynamic. Gaither Dynamic is a system that is going to allow us to present more dynamic, visually appealing, easy to understand dashboards. It's also going to improve my office's capacity to keep this current. To give you a sense of where we started, the initial dashboard was developed by a tech team that did not have knowledge of homelessness, and specifically of the Homeless Management Information System, or any knowledge of our particular HMIS platform through WellSky. So that meant sometimes having a lot of detailed conversations to help make sure we were on the same page about what metrics actually meant. It also meant that that process was not very automated. We had to run reports in HMIS and then enter those results manually into a separate database, and then it would be refreshed on Tableau to actually project to the dashboard. So an update for 1 quarter to that existing dashboard could easily take, no exaggeration, probably 2 to 3 days of Marissa's time. As you know, my office does not have 2 to 3 extra days laying around of any staff member's time. So that's not feasible for us to maintain. Gaither Dynamic is a company. Gaither was an HMIS administrator, specifically has a background working with WellSky, our HMIS vendor, and is very familiar not only with what our system can do, but current with trends. So when there's a major update to data standards, we don't have to go and explain those and redesign our system. He's already doing this for the individuals that he serves in multiple communities across the country. And the beauty of it is it works with existing HMIS reports that we can run exports, upload into his system within a matter of minutes, and automatically within 24 to 48 hours, the dashboard will reflect that new data. So this is a much, much streamlined process, and something I feel much more confident about our ability to maintain, but also the usability for the end user. So first, we have the community analysis dashboard, and I can give you a little bit more information about each of those. So the community analysis dashboard is going to focus on an annual performance report that's ran out of HMIS. I believe it's actually operating off of the RIMUS export. And it's going to help us to understand the number of individuals who are served within our COC and demographic information about those individuals. It also gives some insight into measures that are used to evaluate program performance, such as increased income, average length of time that people receive assistance from programs, etc. So we get very clear, easy to read information. It's framed around questions that might naturally help someone understand what this is telling them. We had ability to go ahead and spotlight a few different subpopulations so we can quickly identify things in a clear, concise way about different subpopulations that we're serving. Also is going to spotlight things like the number of persons that were permanently housed within the reporting range, the success rate for housing referrals, number of individuals increasing income. Obviously, still more work needed. And then we're also going to be able to see additional information about the types of households that we are serving. The highest number of individuals in need within our system are single individuals, and we definitely see that that's the majority of who is being served within the system. And some additional breakdowns. Can't say enough about how much more accessible that I find these dashboards. Just going to briefly preview the other dashboards for you. These should be live, I believe, this week on our website, so you'll have the ability to go in and do a deeper dive. This next dashboard is the community snapshot. This one does have some filtering options that can be applied, so it's a little bit more interactive. You can select the date range that you want to look at, what project type, and specifically what projects, even some subpopulations, and then it will change the results that are on that main dashboard. So this one is going to be helpful for being able to see lots of different layers of data. I also like the fact that we're able to see things like our system inflow versus outflow. I'm gonna think there might be a potential issue for, I see a strong drop there, so I'm gonna look into that. We're also able to kind of see the flow of how individuals are entering our system in terms of what's their homeless or housing situation at presentation, how do they enter our system, and then where are they ultimately exiting to, and what interventions are they accessing during that time. It also allows us to have some data quality measures. I believe this dashboard also has the ability on the back end for us to export some information that can help Marissa to work with providers on improving their data quality. And it gives us grades on data quality so we can easily see, depending on how we have this filtered, how the project or the system is doing in data quality. You're going to see that in most areas, we've really made strong improvements with our data quality. The biggest area is going to be destination. The challenges in collecting destination data is, especially among our congregate shelters, folks don't always like to participate in exit interviews or disclose where they are going. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. There are oftentimes times that individuals would leave shelter without communicating with any staff, and we have to just assume that they are exiting either to the streets or a non-locational value, such as no exit interview completed. So I'm sure if we were to filter, we would see that we're probably going to have a stronger ability for our housing providers to have that information, because you typically have more interaction ongoing with your client, and typically they're going to work with you if they're exiting your program so that they would ideally stay in some form of stable housing. And then the last dashboard that we have for you is the community performance dashboard. This is going to be based on our HUD system performance measures. This one is also a little bit more dynamic in the sense that you can go into each of the individual measures that our system is assessed on, and as you do that, it will display some more detailed results that help you understand how that measure is calculated and how specifically our community performed on that. As a reminder, our system performance measures are going to calculate things like the number of first-time homeless individuals within our system, the length of time that individuals are homeless within the system, increases to income, successful permanent housing retention or exits, and returns to homelessness. So for example, if we wanted to take a look at, let's say, returns, we are then able to look and see not only the basic measures of how many are returning to homelessness within certain time frames, but we could also break that down and look by certain project type. This will be a tool that would be helpful for us to really understand what types of interventions are most successful in a variety of different areas, and we'll be able to target our system performance improvements in the areas that need that work the most. So again, these dashboards should be live probably within the week. We'll send out an announcement via the mailing list so that you're able to take a look at them yourselves and spend whatever level of time that you want to with those. Would there be any initial questions or feedback?
I just had a question. So when you all were creating this, what are kind of the key like fields or metrics that identify an individual? So like first name, last name, like does it work to deduplicate if there were some mistakes, or like what is that process on the back end?
Yeah.
You know?
So one of the things that attracted us to moving in this direction was that when we run reports out of HMIS, if it runs across the system instead of just one project, for example, it's going to do deduplication automatically because our vendors coded it that way. The challenge in taking and translating that into our old database and data dashboard was that, for example, if somebody looked at individual quarters, they would sometimes look at those quarters and say, okay, 10 persons plus 10 persons plus 10 persons plus 10 persons, that's automatically 40 persons that were served in the year. But because of the coding and the way that that developer had worked, it didn't necessarily deduplicate between those periods, so that it might not have been 40 unique individuals that were served across that year. It might have been, say, 30, and there was overlap where somebody wasn't exited by the end of one quarter, so they rolled over into the next. So this is going to be something that is going to, it's all going to be aggregate data, so there's no personally identifying information, but it is going to streamline that process for deduplication.
And I'm assuming it's the same for like households. So like an individual within a household would not be counted within that household, like, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So like 2 people in a household does not count like 2 households, right?
Right, so there would be an ability for us to look at numbers by household or by persons, and then the majority of certain metrics are going to operate off of the head of household. So for example, when income is only going to include head of household and adults, when we look at things like returns, usually it's going to operate off of the head of household first and reading that data. So there's going to be measures, and with it being consistent with the coding of the actual reports within our system, there's not going to be things that are lost in translation or slip between those cracks.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Other feedback?
I think it's really cool. I think that's...
We were excited about it in our office. And the best thing is I found a pathway to fold this into an existing contract and project where there was no cost to the COC, and it's pre-funded for 3 years.
Even better.
So we will, if we want to continue with it, we will not have to come up with additional funds for this dashboard for approximately 3 years. And it's going to automatically be adjusted to comply with any HUD updates to data standards. And if we choose at the end of the 3 years, if we don't really want to, if he say has changed his pricing and packaging, we don't want to accept what that new offer is, we can continue at the original rate that we came into. It just wouldn't include new features that are added. It would just give us the same base features that we presently have. Right. Then I'm going to take a swig of water because I think it's going to be me again. So this one will be quick. COC competition performance review. So as you know, we are likely going to be starting the COC competition process anytime now. The NOFO usually drops in the neighborhood of July. And then usually our final application is going to be due somewhere in the ballpark of September. So with that in mind, one of the ways that we assess our providers during the competition process is looking at some of these performance measures within the context of their individual project to understand how they contribute to our system and help move us towards our goals. That would be a factor in how programs are ranked within the competition and would have a determination of who receives funding and at what level. So going through this process last year, we were able to identify that obviously that process is not only going to reflect true performance, it's also going to reflect things like HMIS data entry, and sometimes it also reflects things like report defects. And so what this process is intended to do is to provide technical assistance to our provider agencies and allow them to go through a review of their performance with us so that we can identify and potentially work to resolve any kinds of issues that might reflect data entry or report defects or other things that might be outside of providers' control, so that then when we go through the competition process, we have more accurate data to assess your true performance, and a provider is not going to be penalized for something like, say, a report defect or how the system reads when there are multiple different values assigned to a field, and specifically reading that off of your project instead of maybe, say, another project the individual interacted with. So this is, again, something intended to help make sure that that is a fair and objective process that we're going through, because being transparent with all we have to do in the competition, Marissa and I don't have the ability to just do a deep dive into all of your measures and understand exactly what's going on with how each is calculated. We have to rely on the reports that we have available, but this gives you the opportunity to then help us spot check and see if there's something that we need to investigate further. The other thing is this would help us to just give you an opportunity to routinely look at your data, and maybe that's something that you do, maybe it's something you don't do. But even if you do, maybe you don't always understand or know exactly what you're looking at or how to translate that into practical guidance for how to move your program forward. So that's going to be a process that we're going to be reaching out to you soon. Right now we're targeting, I believe, the first week of July to try to actually schedule those. We'll be scheduling those as one-on-one calls with providers. So we'll reach out to you in order to schedule those and make sure there's a time and a date that would work for everyone. But it's basically going to be kind of office hours kind of style. We will assign a date and time with your input, and we'll hop on a Zoom call and take a look at that together. And if you prefer in person, we can always make that happen as well. Any questions about that upcoming process?
What would you want us to bring to you? Just our concerns, our areas where we're not sure how to rectify data quality issues?
So we're going to provide some of that guidance when we send out an email invite for those. But one thing is, similar to last year's competition, Marissa and I would like to look at all providers across the same reporting range so that if we went by everyone's actual grant year, it would put everybody at all different time periods, and there may be factors in the real world going on that could change someone's performance if we're looking at different time periods. So to hold everyone to the same standard, we'll likely, for example, choose something like July 1 through June 30th. I believe that's what we used last year. And we will go ahead and let you know what reports that we typically run to assess those measures so that you can take a look at those yourselves. And then what we would ask you to kind of clue in on is looking at those individual measures. Are you seeing something that appears to be an outlier? Like, I think Greenhouse and Community Action Council, we had a household that showed up in that process that it looked like they had not been housed for over a year. That ended up being a report defect where our vendor had not coded a report in a way that it could read housing move-in results off of that program specifically, and that client had transitioned to another source. After that, moved on to an EHV voucher, I believe, and it was reading the second move-in date against the original project enrollment. We don't always have the ability to see that because we don't have the direct knowledge of your clients, but that would be an area where if you see that measure, you're probably going to say, I would know whether or not it took a year for someone to be housed after they were accepted into the program. And then you're able to help us take a look at it. You might not know automatically what's going on within the system. We can help with looking at how is this tied to data entry, how is this tied to the report, and help figure out the technical aspects of what's causing that error.
Thank you.
That was an interesting one because we even mowed her lawn. I think one of our advocates went over to her house, mowed her lawn. I was like, she's housed. I know she's
You're like, I swear, I mowed her yard.
That's right.
All right. Moving along, we will go ahead and give you some updates around HMIS data standards. So the 2024 data standards are out. We anticipate that those are going to likely be effective October 1, and that we'll have a more concrete sense of what specifically that's going to look like. But at a glance, somewhere in my pile of papers, I have a list of some things I can go ahead and tell you, and then Marissa's upcoming end user work group will have a presentation to give more detailed information. I can tell you that right now it doesn't look like a lot of this should be major changes. Typically, HUD will do a more major update about once every 5 years and more minor updates in the interim years. So we are going to have some changes to a lot of the project setup stuff, which won't mean a lot for our end users and providers. Some of the things that will impact you, we're going to have the ability to have a little bit more granular data around coordinated entry. We're going to be able to set up projects where they can be identified as access points for coordinated entry, as well as whether they participate as a housing provider. That should allow us to do different layers of analysis on different measures. Some of the big ones that are going to impact you are going to be around universal data elements. So for example, there's going to be a data collection instruction change around name, where clients may provide a preferred name and legal name is not going to be required any further unless it's required by the particular funder. I anticipate that could be one that might present some challenges for us as a COC. So we're going to get you detailed information about what funding sources are requiring use of legal name. I think it could make it harder for us to identify individuals, avoid duplication within our system. So we're definitely going to have to put some measures in place to help keep our data clean. On a similar note, HUD COC and ESG programs and PATH programs are only going to be required to enter the last 4 digits of Social Security number. That could, coupled with a move to preferred name, make it a lot more challenging to identify individuals correctly within the database. Race and ethnicity are going to be combined into a single data element. There's also going to be some new responses, such as Middle Eastern or North African, added to the response options. And there will also be a text box added where you can provide additional details. Gender is similarly going to change. Female is going to be changed to woman or girl if child. Male is going to be changed to man or boy if child. They're going to change gender other than, now is going to be non-binary. There's going to be a culturally specific identity option, and there's a different identity option that comes with an additional text box. Do have some concern about the level of text boxes that are being added to some of this data. Traditionally, text boxes make it really hard to do data analysis because things are not uniform. And so that can create some problems in how things are grouped and analyzed. So we'll definitely give you more information about what's going to be coming ahead with that. Enrollment COC code is going to have some shift in terms of data collection. It's only going to be required at project start. So providers that have had issues with individuals being served across multiple COCs, maybe they're enrolled with you and then they enroll on a project in the balance of state and you get errors for COC code. This is something that should help resolve that. There's going to be a change in the language for approximate date homelessness started to explicitly include that we are capturing information around this episode of homelessness. That's always been the definition that's been applied, but it's never been displayed that way within the system. So it takes a lot of coaching to our end users, especially new users, to get them to understand how to properly complete that field. We're also going to see the coordinated entry assessment and coordinated entry event fields go away. Those were the fields that currently helped us understand if someone had an assessment completed and what the outcome was. For example, if they were placed onto the by name list. And then the event field was our referral tracking field. Those are going to be combined into a new coordinated entry activity field. It's going to combine all of that into one. We're hoping to have much greater detail soon to share with you about how that's actually going to function. But at a glance, we're hoping that it will improve that. We have a really hard time, in particular, with the coordinated entry assessment field. People put in the assessment results for the VI SPDAT itself, but don't complete the coordinated entry assessment field. And so what that does when we run our coordinated entry performance report, it looks like far fewer people are being assessed within our coordinated entry system than are actually receiving assessments in the real world. We're losing lots of data that way. So this should hopefully improve that. They're doing away with the well-being field that was for our permanent supportive housing providers. There's going to be a requirement for PSH providers to start collecting and entering data around sexual orientation. Marissa and I will be engaging in some conversations and have conversations with you all. We might just elect, even though it's right now specifically required of PSH providers, we might choose to go ahead and implement that across the system just so that we have the ability to do more comparisons across the system instead of only within program types. Also, I anticipate a lot of times when HUD makes these changes, they start with requiring it for one type of program, and then we see it rolled out for other programs and funding sources at a later time. So that might just potentially help us get ahead of where data standards could go in the future. And then Alicia and our veterans providers, there's going to be several different changes for SSVF, which will make sure that we have the ability to support you guys with. Again, most of these are going to be pretty minor changes, so hopefully it won't mean a lot of additional training or explanation needed to your end users. But we do encourage that you have someone within your agency attempt to attend that next end user work group where Marissa's going to be able to present further information. So finally, I get a break and I get to say, Dylan, we're going to switch gears and go to continuing business. Would you have any thoughts or comments around returns to homelessness review? We had presented a draft of that last meeting and you were unable to join us, so.
Yeah, unfortunately I wasn't able to be there for that, so I missed the comments that happened, but when I read the minutes, it seemed as though there were still some like generalized concerns with what that would be for and who that would be serving. So to give a very, very brief recap, it would be specifically to identify gaps within our system that cause returns to homelessness from our projects. And when I say returns to homelessness, I mean the definition as it pertains to this data element. So somebody who was in a project, rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, was housed and then exits positively and returns to our system as experiencing homelessness within 2 years. Now, there's some discussion about where do we want to look at specifically, 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years. Flexible, right? Because it can be harder to identify the things as being directly related to what happened when they were in our program 2 years down the road versus 6 months or a year, right? So that's what it's for. It's not like to punish programs or rank programs or assess program success or anything like that. It's only to identify areas we can improve either within our own COC or by stronger connection with other providers in the community. So that's what it's for, it's who it serves, and kind of the goal. What are some of the concerns that people might have with implementation of something like that?
Not that I'm eager to speak again, but what I found was when you and I had talked about it, we thought, there might be some hurdles and a provider feeling uncomfortable if the reviewers or the reviews team was to be composed of other providers. It might feel like one provider was critiquing the performance of another provider. So we had thought the easiest way to go would maybe be to have neutral parties. The only challenge then becomes, I think the concern in the last meeting was, how are we going to identify enough neutral parties to serve on that team and then actually have the capacity to implement the review as kind of envisioned?
And that's fair. I think that in initial discussion, one of the more obvious solutions would be to include members of the board that don't have a direct connection to a provider that receives funding. But that's a big ask, right? Like you're asking somebody to devote a few hours at least every quarter to this process. And so I can't necessarily guarantee or speak for those individuals' time. But that was one identified solution to that. Not perfect by any means, right? But that's one potential solution that we came up with. Are there other concerns surrounding that particular part of this? Okay, cool. I mean, I'm happy with that.
I don't have a concern, like I really don't. And I'm like, we're the ones putting most people on there, right? The thing I think we're going to see is that the people that return to homelessness are the people that we didn't have anything to do with.
Well, that's the thing. So
Are we including?
we're not
just
including.
people that are appropriately coordinated.
So it would only be people who had a successful housing placement in a permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing program.
Okay. So what about one of the programs?
Yes. So it actually,
I really have no concern on that at all.
yeah. And it would even only be people that exit positive.
Yeah.
So like if a person just, leaves the unit without telling somebody and just disappears for no apparent reason to us and comes back into our community a year later, that's not an individual we would be looking at. This is more for those placements or those exits where it's exit to permanent housing with or without subsidy, right? That's one of the ones. There's a couple other things, but that's one of them. And so what happened after that successful exit that caused them to return to homelessness is the question that we're trying to answer. And it's not, again, to identify issues with programs. That's not the goal.
I'd like to see that, like where our referrals are going wrong. I think that's useful to people who are doing their referrals. And so, like, I don't see it as a negative thing at all, or like you're trying this stuff. I think it'd be very useful to know why these aren't working out. It's frustrating to see them not work out, so it would be nice to have, to be able to sit down and see like what happened. So I'm all for that, whatever, we can do to participate in that.
I'm kind of with David. I mean, I don't think it should be a gotcha, certainly, but it is sometimes helpful to go, as we're kind of reviewing this in a best practice way, this might be actually beneficial, like, I don't know, we would be, if you said, oh my gosh, Greenhouse 17, that was terrible what you did, but here's some ways that maybe this might have actually come up with a better situation. I would hope that most everybody in the room would be okay with that. And then to flip a little bit what you said, sometimes it's nice to have program people. I find program people sometimes understand the obstacles a little bit better. So I might reach out to Marty and go, oh my gosh, I really don't want this situation to happen. But I think, I'm just picking on you because you're across from me. But you kind of can feel the same pain because we work with people that can be really complicated and systems can be complicated. Sometimes program people are really good allies in that, where I know when I work with our coalition, they're not kind of on the ground running, and so they sometimes aren't quite as, I don't know. They're a little more euphoric or something, whatever that word is.
Yeah, I was saying that. I think it might be good to have a mix because you get that from the providers. I would be.
Yeah.
I would think they would be a little more like empathetic as far as
I do too.
what's going on. But I think it's good to have outside
I do
eyes
too.
too because I think they can see it from a different perspective because sometimes
Yeah.
providers get so already so involved in it that sometimes they may miss things that people that are from the outside can see.
I think that's a really good idea. And I do agree with you that there is that empathy there. I think the strong concern was that there is a fear of somebody maybe feeling like picked on, which again, the way that we structured it, that should not occur because the suggestions are going to be system-wide, not program-specific, right?
And I think when we were talking about that, when those concerns were brought up, I think there was an idea out there that it would happen during like the performance review.
Yeah, and that's...
And I think that's where it kind of...
I think another
bubbled up.
thing that kind of resolved some of that concern was that too, I think some of the providers that initially had concern were misunderstanding how we were defining the return, that it's a client that they successfully transitioned to permanent housing upon exit, and then that client later returns within a 2-year period. And I think that alleviated some of the provider concerns because they thought that if we're going through this process, what's an individual going to say where this has been a challenging dynamic from project enrollment through exit, where this person potentially did not participate in services, maybe did not agree with any rules or policies, did not get along with their particular case manager or the staff. And I think when we put that into context, it also helped alleviate some of the concerns that were initially raised by providers.
I think it also helps that no one in this group is new.
Yeah.
And like we've all worked for like multiple agencies and like I think like I wouldn't feel comfortable with anybody like in this group being on that committee because I think we all have a fairly good idea of what each other do, like the ins and outs of the program. So I don't really feel like I wouldn't feel negative about that at all. And sometimes it's good to get input from other providers.
And I think that's fair. I think we're all coming at it from a place of wanting to benefit those we serve and to benefit the system. And I think, for example, probably several of you in the room know that if someone was to come to me and they have a complaint, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, Marty, hey, Mary, hey, David. What's the situation here? This is what was reported to us. What was your experience in this situation? So we have to acknowledge that there's at least two sides to every story. So I don't think anyone's going to necessarily come at this with the wrong mindset. And I think a lot of us understand, as providers too, that process of looking critically at performance.
And nicely, with the way that at least the draft is structured, it kind of removes some of those pieces. Like obviously we're going to allow space for a person to talk if they're venting about something. We're not going to immediately stop them. But we will be redirecting back to the question, which does not really allow for a critique of an individual program. These questions are more about their own experience of what caused them to return to homelessness and what they think could have been different to stop it. That's really what it centers around. So I think it should work pretty well to not do that, but I might be missing something as, one of the two that worked on it, So I'm always happy to hear anything that I could add or change. Definitely going to look into maybe rewording some of the stuff to add at least one person who is part of a program. maybe even 2, so that one could sit out if it would be a participant from theirs that's returned.
Another possibility too would be also to look at maybe folks who are associated with provider agencies but maybe don't have an active role within that actual project.
Yeah, which makes sense too. You know, I mean, for example, not volunteering, just an example, David, right? You know, you could do that. So that's, and nobody would be like, Hope Centers is dragging me over the coals. Like, that's not what's going on.
And having maybe a small group, like, a couple to 3 providers on there, so like one could pull out if there was a conflict, or, I mean, it seems very doable.
It's that piece of where do we put it, I think, was the biggest challenge because, as Alicia had mentioned, putting it with the program performance and evaluation committee, while that makes sense for identifying people to review, it's kind of hard to decouple that from the, is this about my performance? So there's that feeling piece there that I get. I think now too, with that dashboard that has been created, that may help alleviate a little bit of that because we'll be able to in real time identify people who are returning. So placing it there isn't as necessary now, if that makes sense.
I think another idea to consider in terms of the composition, we could always also look at, I think it would be best to only approach participants and interviewing them with a handful, maybe 3 individuals at most, and not overwhelm them with a group. But if we had a larger group of reviewers, then it would not necessarily be the same reviewers each time. We would have the ability to make sure, for example, if there was a rapid rehousing provider, then maybe it's a housing provider other than rapid rehousing that's part of that particular review. We can kind of mix and match and vary those in strategic ways.
That's smart. Yeah, I think that would be good. And
it also then lessens the overall commitment for those that are participating in the reviews team so that they're not necessarily having to complete multiple reviews in addition to all their other duties.
yeah.
You have a consistent, so like for consistency's sake, you would want a group to be evaluated in the same way each time, even though you have different individuals doing that. So I'm assuming you'd have like some form of like formatted interview with the same questions.
It's actually in the draft, but that was like several meetings ago.
And I apologize, I didn't put the draft since there were no changes to it in this packet, but it sounds like Dylan and I have the ability to make some edits and bring another draft forward.
Yeah, and in there, as it sits presently, I think there's like roughly 5 questions for the provider and for the participant.
We would treat it kind of like the BI spit out, where you ask the question as it's worded. If they need help understanding, clarifying, definitely, but we're then kind of sticking to the same information regardless of who's completing the review.
And that will help mitigate I didn't like my case manager because of this or that, because that's not part of the questions. Right.
And a lot of the draft language of those questions was very generalized to the system. What types of assistance or intervention do you feel like would have helped you to be more successful in maintaining housing? So remove the focus from the project level and try to shift it back towards the system.
I should know this, but I don't. So the evaluation of the system, is it pretty much focusing on the housing system? So like to take domestic violence as an example, I might expect that you might go, the relationship kicked back in and violence was going on in the home and I had to leave, or I'm on a big child support kick right now and I wasn't getting child support, so financially I was vulnerable. Is there opportunity to see things outside of that?
Yes.
Okay.
The way it's specifically worded by my memory, it's broad enough that it's not just the housing system. Because one of the questions is what supports or services could have helped you, what do you think would have helped you the most? If that's the answer, that would be the answer. Yeah.
Okay.
So, because there is the understanding that housing is only one piece of a huge puzzle. Because we're talking about a pretty complex system of the experience of poverty, and there's a lot at play there. And it can't just be our COC that's the only component.
So we'll work on getting an updated draft to you for next time. I'm going to move us forward to housing triage system. We have reflected several different minor updates. Most of this came to this committee last time, but we only, I think, have maybe you were the only housing provider that was with us. We didn't want to put Christina on the spot. So we also got some feedback during our twice a month coordinated entry case conferencing meetings. And so I included a prettier version of the draft, updated by untold content. I'll point out some of the major changes since they're not going to be highlighted. Page 10, just that whole process infographic and the steps that are listed throughout the manual. We took out that additional, at one point we had 2 projects that were running. One was for folks that were at imminent risk and one was for those that are literally homeless. That other project for those that were at risk was removed from HMIS, and we still had a policy manual that reflected a project and a step that no longer existed. So this is just putting it in line with our actual practice. Page 11, under access, we had discussed previously that individuals that are entering through a VSP will have the ability to opt in or opt out of having their information included within HMIS. I believe that we've talked about that and you guys were cool with that since that's what you guys are doing in the balance of state. And then they've been moved to addendums, but the opening and closing scripts have been modified to make them a little bit shorter and a little bit more simplified language in some areas. I think that opening script at one point was like a page at least. So hopefully this will just make you still able to convey the information that's needed, but maybe just be a little bit more succinct and easy for you to deliver. The consensus around the by name list is that we do not wish as a system to move towards only referring individuals who are document ready. As in previous iterations of the manual, we will still have a preference if 2 individuals have basically the same length of time homeless, the same acuity, same basic factors, and one is document ready and one is not. We're going to continue to have a preference for referring the document ready individual or household to keep fast movement, but we are not going to restrict referrals only to those who are document ready. We're also going to spend time in each of those case conferencing meetings specifically looking at the list of persons who are not document ready so that we can engage the group in identifying barriers to obtaining that documentation and getting it into the system. On page 19, we just explicitly added some information and clarity around vulnerability factors and that those will not supplement or replace acuity and determination of what resources are appropriate for an individual or household's needs, but that if we have individuals that have the same acuity, that we are going to consider vulnerability factors and who might need a more timely intervention. That's going to include things like individuals having a verified terminal illness, verified that an individual is currently pregnant, if an individual might not have the ability to read or comprehend English. So just really thinking about, for those that might be on the streets or in a shelter setting, things that might make them more vulnerable and not necessarily anything that's going to skew the type of resource that they receive. And then there had been some discussion around whether or not that we would change the time frames that would appear places like page 23 describing the placement process. So we kept those. For example, providers of housing still have 2 business days. We did clarify that's business days to respond to a referral, and that the assessing organization still has 7 business days to complete required documentation. We did at one point have some conversation about potentially extending or changing some of those time frames. but no one had really arrived at particular suggestions. So we stuck to clarifying that they're business versus calendar days. And the present draft is going to be keeping the same time frames, although we would have the ability to either vote to approve this draft as is with the motion to change those time frames to specific different time frames, or to come back to the drawing board and present a draft again next time. But those are the major changes. This should be consistent with the conversations that we've had both within this meeting and the case conferencing meetings. Was there any questions from those of you that participate in coordinated entry or don't that might have had an opportunity to review the draft?
I think it's fine. And I think we had talked about in previous coordinated entry meetings with like the time frames, if for some reason we're actively working with a client, like as long as we're communicating that to all parties, if it goes past like that time frame, that would be okay.
Yeah.
As long as efforts are being made and it's being communicated.
And in practice, we've done that. So I think it would not be anything that would be a detriment to us.
I'm fine with moving forward with this draft.
Same, it makes total sense.
Okay. So it sounds like a lot of our providers participating in coordinated entry are comfortable. If there's not other suggestions, I would go ahead and call for a motion to approve the draft.
Can I do that or is that before?
It's a full membership though, because it's committee.
I'll move.
Yeah, second.
I never know when we're allowed to.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I should reference.
Double asterisk means you're allowed.
Okay.
Any other discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the motion passes. Can't tell you how happy I am to have a draft that is pretty and actually reflects reality. So thank you for engaging us in the work to get something through. All right. Just a reminder, we're going to continue those twice monthly case conferencing meetings. We're seeing great progress come out of those meetings, both in terms of list cleanup and making successful referrals. At this time, we don't feel like we can really reduce those without detriments to the system. So we're going to continue to do those twice a month. I believe that's the first and third Thursdays via Zoom. If anybody would like to attend those case conferencing meetings that's not already, reach out to myself or Marissa. We can get you an Outlook invite to get that on your calendar. Next, I'm going to have just a few announcements related to HMIS. There should have been in your packet a listing of upcoming new user trainings. Marissa's next new user training is scheduled for June 15th. It's going to be 9 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. You can just email her. The paper with the dates will have her email address. You can reach out if you need to get anybody scheduled for training. Additionally, I mentioned earlier that end user work group that's going to occur on July 11th, and will focus on presentation of expected changes of the HMIS data standards. And then we'll probably bring at that time to the August meeting of this group, we will hopefully have a more finalized draft from HUD. Usually during this process, they go through about 7 versions of that document. So we want to make sure that before we would bring it to this group and really work on doing formal education, that we have something that's not likely to change again. Marissa should also be working with you if you are an agency participating in HMIS for the annual license renewals. We need to have an accurate sense so that we can order our licenses of the needs of our agencies, how many users that they require within the system, if there's been changes so we can identify and remove inactive users who might have left your agency or changed roles. And then there's some annual requirements to make sure that individuals are familiar with policies, are following security protocols, etc. She should have sent out an initial email around June 5th with that information, and that's going to be due at the end of July. any questions around HMAS trainings and announcements? All right, then at this time, I think I'm ready to open us up for other issues and public sharing. Y'all, it's an opportunity for me now to talk. It's your chance to shine. Anybody have anything they want to share? All right. If not, we'll be back for this committee on August 2nd here at the Don Ball Campus Center. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
All right, Joy's got it. Thank you all.